Hey everybody, how's it going? So today I want to take some time out of doing deep dives and whatnot and just talk a little bit about my musical journey. How did I get to where I am today, where music is a substantial part of my life? I don't go a day without thinking about records or music or my favorite bands or buying records. It's completely an obsession. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. But how did I get to this point? Where did I start out? And so this is kind of a trip down memory lane for me. It's a huge nostalgia, indulgent kind of video that I'm making right now. So the first music that I actually remember like listening to on a turntable, and it wasn't even my turntable, but I remember I think it was either my uncle or my dad had some Beach Boys singles, and these were the two like greatest hits that I distinctly remember seeing these covers, and I believe they were in my uncle's collection, because in later years I don't remember these being in my dad's collection, but it was like both two volumes of the Beach Boys, like the best. And the first song that I really connected with, listening to it on a 45, and I don't have the 45, I wish I did. This is the nearest thing. The first thing that grabbed me was this yellow and orange swirl. It just stood out. It was like, I thought this label was so cool. I know it's Brian Wilson. I didn't grab a Beach Boys one, but I was just kind of in a hurry. But that capital yellow and orange swirl I thought was the coolest. But the song that really grabbed me was Wouldn't It Be Nice? My dad or one of my uncles had that on a single, and the opening bars of that song, like instantly I fell in love with. And so I think just because I really reacted so well, then they started playing. And again, I'm pretty sure it was my uncles or my dad started playing these for me. And the Beach Boys were my first love, my first musical obsession. Loved the music. And this was not like at the age I'm talking about, I was probably like 4 or 5, or maybe at the oldest 6 years old. So I was not collecting records. I didn't have a turntable. It was just music that grabbed me, and that I thought was the coolest. And then I still remember, like when I hear Wouldn't It Be Nice, I still remember like being at my uncle's, seeing that orange and yellow swirl on the turntable and thinking this was the coolest song ever. But obviously the rest of the Beach Boys catalog, the songs on that I loved as well. And then the next artist that I fell in love with, that I got into, and this was now by the time where I was getting like records, hand-me-down records, like my dad or my uncle would purge their record collections and say, here, you can have this. Because by that time, I had like this real super cheap turntable. It was, I don't even remember what it looked like, but I'm sure it had like an 8-track tape player embedded in it. That's how old this thing was. And it was all dusty. You could smell the dust and the mildew on it. It was really an artifact, even back then. And I'm talking like the early 70s. But the first album that I ever got, that I ever actually owned, like new record that I actually ever owned, I got it for my birthday. I think it must have been my 6th birthday. I got Elton John's Greatest Hits. And because it was the first album I ever owned, and my dad had a bunch of Elton John records, like those early classic Elton John records. So I had heard his music and I liked it. And knowing that I liked it, I got this for my I think it was, my parents for my birthday got this for me. And I played the death out of it, loved it. I mean, what's not to love? This has got nothing but huge instant classics on there. And then I remember for my next birthday, I got Elton John's Greatest Hits Volume 2. So I had both volumes of that. My dad didn't even have this record, so there was some stuff on here like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Pinball Wizard that I had never heard before. So I was like all in on Elton John, and that lasted till probably I was about, yeah, it had to have been when I was 10 years old. And then John Lennon got shot and died, and I didn't know anything about the Beatles back in 1980 when that happened. I knew nothing. Like, I'd probably heard maybe a song or two uh, on the radio, but wasn't really paying attention. And I remember the day, I still remember the day that he died. Like, I found out, like, I don't know, it was like the day after. It was all over the news. And I was asking my dad, like, who's John Lennon? And he's like, what do you mean, who's John Lennon? You don't know who John Lennon is? I'm like, no, I had no idea. And so they were playing Beatles music on the radio more than ever because everybody who was a music fan, or at least Beatle fan, whatever, was in shock and in mourning. And so I started to hear more Beatle music on the radio. And I remember my parents took me to Kmart, which is kind of the equivalent of Target. It was like a retail store. I don't think there's any around anymore. But they took me there, and they basically said, okay, you've got $20. You can buy whatever records you want. Or they said, you got $20. You can buy whatever. And I was used to buying, if I'd go to Kmart, I was buying Star Wars figures or Matchbox cars or stuff like that. But this was like my first adult purchase. I'm going to go into the record department and I'm going to pick out some records. And obviously, there was no question, because I had started hearing Beatles music, that I wanted to get deeper into the Beatles. And so the first two Beatle records that this was Rock and Roll Music Volume 1. And these were budget releases. They're on a Green Capital label. And this was a double album that had come out, obviously, if you're a Beatles fan, in like 1976 or something like that. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, Capitol split them up, sold them separately on their budget label. But this was my first real exposure to Beatles music that was not She Loves You or I Want to Hold Your Hand or Can't Buy Me Love. And I played these to death. Like, literally, come home from school, from the time I got home from school until the time I went to bed, I would do my homework or just sit and listen and stare at this picture of the Beatles and read the note. Not that there was much, but just look at the song titles, read the credits, and just absorb all of this music. And back then, I didn't even know who was John, who was singing. I didn't know, like, for instance, Twist and Shout is the first song that opens the record. I had no idea who that was singing, and my dad had to tell me that's John Lennon singing. And then on the next song, I saw her standing there. That's Paul McCartney. I had no idea. Their voices sounded the same. At that young age, I couldn't distinguish between their voices. And then I had this tape recorder. It was an Emerson tape recorder, and I got some blank tapes, and I would listen to the radio, and I had two speakers, and I would listen to like the rock and roll stations back then, the classic rock stations. And anytime a Beatles song would come on, I'd race, get my tape recorder, put it up against a speaker, and hit record, and get whatever snippet of that particular song that I could find. And I didn't know, like, this was before the internet. I didn't have a lot of information about what song was on what album, or even what the titles of the song were. And so I'd hear a song and I'd be pretty sure that it was a Beatles song, if it was one that I wasn't already familiar with. But I remember like taping on the radio, like Sgt. Pepper, Straight Into, With a Little Help from My Friends, Day Tripper, Come Together, all these songs. And it really, like, I had been into the Beach Boys and I had been into Elton John, but nothing grabbed me the way that these Beatles songs would grab me. In fact, I remember hearing Maybe I'm Amazed on the radio and thinking that was the Beatles, because I didn't know, and the DJ didn't say who it was. I knew it was Paul McCartney, but I didn't know it was solo Paul McCartney. I thought this must be a Beatles song, and so I taped it along with the other Beatles songs that I had. And a lot of times it was just like half of a song, the beginning or the end of a song after the DJ announced what it was, or this is the Beatles on WLLZ, and then the song would play. But I soaked up so much Beatles music. And this is before, like, obviously, I'm a little kid. I did not have the budget to be owning records, just going out and I like that song. I'll go find out what album it's on and I'll go buy it. Like, I was not afforded that luxury. Like, growing up, we didn't have a lot of money. And so it really was, to go out and buy a record was a huge deal. And sometimes my dad would come home from work and he would have a record that he would pick up on the way home. Like, I got Beatles 65 that way. I remember he got me the Hard Day's Night soundtrack. Just came home from work, and from then on, it was like every time my dad came home, I'd be like, "Did you get me a record? Is there a record? Does he have a record under his arm?" So anyway, that was, I think, where my obsession started. And so I got these two records, and then I had all the, these cassette tapes, these blank cassette tapes with all this Beatle music that I had recorded. And then it was the next time where my parents were like, okay, you can go to the store. It was my allowance, or I don't know. Somehow I had earned the money. Like, now you can go pick another record up. And that was another thing. Like, you'd go into the record bins and there were so many Beatle albums there. And it was like, what one do I pick? And I remember when I got this one, it was like, okay, there's Abbey Road. It was probably like some stuff like the early Beatles, or maybe, I don't even know what was out. I think like the Beatles Rarities album was out there, and wondering, what is this all about? But there was no internet. There was no way to find out what these records were. Were they greatest hits? Were they, odds and ends, or whatever they were? And so sorting through the bins, and I finally picked out Sgt. Pepper, and I think it was because the cover just jumped out at me, and I was going to spend a lot of time listening to this, and so it had the lyrics on the back, not just the song titles like the rock and roll music volumes had. So that was a bonus, and it was a gatefold also, which was cool. My light just died. Great timing. All right, so I'll just be in the shadows, I guess. That's my cue that my video's gone on too long, is when your lighting system craps out on you. But anyway, picked this up, and it had a gatefold, and there was an insert with the mustaches and the Sgt. Pepper badges. And literally, I would spend an entire weekend listening to this, listening to the other two Beatle albums I had, which I misplaced. I don't even know where I put them. Oh, over here. Listening to these two, and listening to my tape recorded music, or waiting on the radio for more Beatles songs to come on that I could tape. And it's really something that I feel has kind of been lost. I mean, I have over 1,000 records, and a lot of that magic of just owning a record, it was a big deal. If you were a music fan, a little young music fan like me, it was a huge deal back then to have one record, let alone 5 or 6 or however many I had. So that's when I started building my collection. And then I would start getting records like Boston's record. These were like purged albums from my family's collection. I got the Bee Gees, Best of Bee Gees. Remember listening to this. And this was the Bee Gees. The only Bee Gees I knew were obviously the disco Bee Gees. My dad had the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and used to play that a lot. And I remember thinking, well, I didn't know there were 4 Bee Gees. How the hell were there 4 Bee Gees? And this didn't sound anything like the disco music, but it did sound more like the Beatles, which I liked a lot. So I loved that record. And then my uncle found a copy of this. I don't think it was I think it was like some sort of secondhand store copy of this, introducing the Beatles. And this did have, I saw her standing on it. But another confusing thing, and you really had to you had to piece this stuff together yourself, because on the back of this record, it would tell you like what albums these are from. And Twist and Shout, it said it was from the early Beatles. I think, I can't read it, I don't have my glasses, but I'm like, well, if it's on the early Beatles, then what is it doing on here? Like, I couldn't make sense of, I didn't know anything about different labels or the whole, before the Beatles came to America, their catalog was on VJ and other obscure labels. I didn't know any of that, so it was all kind of like a mystery to me. But every album that I would get meant that it wasn't a crap, shitty copy from like a mono one speaker. And that was the other thing. When I put the tape recorder up to the speakers, as you know, on a lot of those Beatles records, you'd have voices coming out of one speaker and music on the other. So if I put the tape recorder up to the wrong speaker, I might just get the music. If I put it up to the other speaker, I might just get the vocals. So it was not ideal, but it was the best that I had to get all that music. But having a record meant I actually own this music. I don't have to have the DJ talking over the beginning or the end of it, or have it cut off because I didn't get the tape recorder up to the speaker and press record on time. It was actually special because on demand, I could put that record on the turntable and hear all that great music. So it was a big deal when I got that one. And then the next record that I went out and bought, and I remember going to the mall, and again, it was one of those deals where you've got this huge bin of Beatle records and looking at all those titles and like, which one do I want? And it wasn't like today where you can get the music online, or you have the luxury of buying several records by an artist if you have the budget for such a purchase. But it was really like, okay, which ones do I want to have on demand to be able to play? And it was Magical Mystery Tour. And I remember being so excited because of the songs that I had tape recorded. Some of my favorites were on here, like Strawberry Fields Forever, Hello Goodbye, Penny Lane, Magical Mystery Tour. I remember being so excited when I got this, and it was a gatefold again, although the copy that I got, it was like an early 80s Capitol where they no longer had the booklet in the middle. You would just open the gatefold and they'd have like the credits on the left side and then the lyrics to the movie songs on the right. The booklet was not part of it, but it was still a gatefold. There were still lyrics. And I remember, again, just being so excited to have these songs, to be able to play these songs whenever I wanted. I Am the Walrus. I first heard that. One of my teachers played it. It was the Blue Album. She had the Blue Album, and it was for music class. And she was playing some of the songs off that Blue Album. And I think actually, now that I'm thinking about it now, that was probably another like gateway to the Beatles for me, was maybe hearing a teacher play some songs at school. But anyway, that's how I got into the Beatles. This video is way longer than I anticipated, but last thing I wanted to show were just like some early, because I couldn't afford albums, not many albums. Like I'd hear a song on the radio. I knew I'm not gonna go out and get an album for one song. That was not a great use of my limited spending money that I would have to buy albums. If I was going out and buying a record, it was going to be a Beatles record. So I would get 45s because they were only a couple bucks. And you could have the song, again, play it on demand. So some of the first ones that I had were Eye of the Tiger, which after seeing Rocky 3, everybody my age was running out and getting this in one form or another. So I had this one. I had Van Halen's Jump, which I loved that song when that came out. So I got the single for that. The Rolling Stones, Start Me Up. This is another one that I have a visceral reaction to whenever I hear the opening of this song. It reminds me. And again, that label, that Rolling Stones label, is another one that I see that, and it totally takes me back to when I was in grade school, playing this on the turntable over and over and over again. I love that single. And then AC/DC, Let's Get It Up. I heard that. It was after Back in Black, obviously, had been such a hit. And so they were playing this single. It was one of the first singles off of For Those About to Rock. I loved it and got that single as well. So anyway, that's just basically in a nutshell how my musical journey started. I felt inspired to do that. I don't know why, but hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'd love to hear you share your stories in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and take care.